Hi, BookTube, and welcome to part 2 of my reading vlog. I'm making my way through about 700 pages of Orlando Fige's Cultural History of Russia titled Natasha's Dance. Now, my last video, which I posted on the 9th of December, looked at the introduction and the first 2 chapters and ended with the big shock that was Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. The next chapter, chapter 3, is titled Moscow, Moscow, and it focuses on what happened to that city, the results for that city of Napoleon's invasion. And it opens with what Napoleon is supposed to have said when he first caught sight of the place. And so the quote I'm going to read now is from page 150. "There it is at last, this famous town." That's what he's supposed to have said as he surveyed the place from the nearby Sparrow Hills. But it's heart town. Did Napoleon really refer to Moscow as a town? That was cheek. Figes goes on to say, "The city's palaces, sparkling in the sun, were spread out spaciously across the plain, and on the far side Napoleon could just make out a long black column of people coiling out of its distant gates. 'Are they abandoning all this?' the emperor exclaimed. 'It isn't possible.' Of course, we know the people did abandon Moscow completely. Not only that, they organized arsonists, disguised, I think, as just beggars, to set fire to the city so that Napoleon and his army could not use it as a base. They were forced out not long after they had marched in. And that meant, of course, that when the war was over, the city needed to be completely rebuilt. And it's in this chapter that Figes talks about that rebuilding and how, of course, it meant that over the course of the 19th century, Moscow became sort of the new city, the focal point. If you remember, the first chapter, of course, talked about the building of St. Petersburg and how revolutionary that was in a cultural and political sense, because it meant that the focal point of the country became this seaport, this westward-facing seaport with classical architecture, where the society very much copied and mimicked European manners. By the rebuilding of the more inland city of Moscow meant a whole different cultural viewpoint, one that was a little bit more inward-looking and regarded, I suppose, ultimately as more Russian. Now, this chapter, it doesn't deal with the rebuilding per se, not the actual, physical buildings. It focuses really on a cultural and social evaluation of the city. There was a pantheon of artists and patrons of the arts who were beginning to look for a more authentic Russian expression for architecture, writing, music, painting. And these personalities, they flocked to Moscow. Moscow became the forward-looking place. It overtook St. Petersburg, and it was the place where a Russian merchant class was beginning to grow richer, beginning to industrialize the country. And so they formed an influential urban social layer that sometimes was in opposition to the landed aristocracy. This chapter takes us up into the early 20th century, by which time you had a Russian commercial class who, as you would expect, had embraced the industrial advances that had been happening across Europe in the previous century. They believed that what was now holding Russia back was this antiquated rural economy. Their way of life had not changed a great deal. Orlando Figes actually spent some time discussing how Chekhov's play, The Cherry Orchard, is a satire on this rural status quo that was resisting change. And so I think I'm going to need to study the context of that play in depth and then read it sometime soon. By the end of the chapter, you totally understand why Moscow superseded St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg did not transform. I mean, Moscow did after Napoleon, but then it did again after the 1917 revolution, when Stalin completely rebuilt the center of the city. And he tried to replace the strong Orthodox piety with reinventions of those old devotions. I'm going to close this section by reading from page 215 about that. Soviet Moscow was supremely confident. Its confidence reflected in the huge building projects of the 1930s, the mass manufacture of motor cars, the first metros, and the forward upward images of socialist realist art. Moscow's old wooden houses were bulldozed. Churches were destroyed. A vast new parade route was constructed through the center of the city. The old Tver Boulevard was broadened out and renamed Gorky Street. A Revolution Square was laid out in the site of the old market, and Red Square was cleared of its market stalls. In this way, the Lenin Mausoleum, the sacred altar of the revolution, became the destination of the mass parades on May Day and Revolution Day. With their armed march past the Kremlin, the citadel of Holy Russia, these parades were imitations of the old religious processions they had replaced. There were even plans to blow up St. Basil's Cathedral so that the marchers could file past the revolution's leaders standing in salute on the mausoleum's roof and march off in one unbroken line. Chapter 4. This chapter is titled The Peasant Marriage, and it's not going to be clear right away what on earth that's referring to. I got very excited when I first read this chapter because I knew very, very little about the 1861 Emancipation Manifesto. This was declared by Tsar Alexander II, and it freed the serfs from being tied to the landed aristocracy. Tsar Alexander II was very influenced by abolitionist activity in other parts of Europe, and he also favored the emancipation of slaves in the United States, which followed shortly after. What was most amazing, though, for me, was in spite the reality of the lives of these serfs, there was this idealized view of peasants and their qualities. I'm going to read you from page 224. Each theory, this is the theory about the peasantry, it says, each theory ascribed certain virtues to the peasant, which it then took as the essence of the national character. For the populists, the peasant was a natural socialist, the embodiment of the collective spirit that distinguished Russia from the bourgeois West. Democrats like Herzen saw the peasant as a champion of liberty, his wildness embodying the spirit of the Russia that was free. The Slavophiles regarded him as a Russian patriot, suffering and patient, a humble follower of truth and justice, like the folk hero Ilya Muromets. They argued that the peasant commune was a living proof that Russia need not look beyond its national borders for guiding moral principles. A commune, declared one of the movement's founding members, is a union of the people who have renounced their egoism, their individuality, and who express their common accord. This is an act of love, a noble Christian act. Dostoevsky, too, saw the peasant as a moral animal, the embodiment of the Russian soul. Once he even claimed in a famous argument that the simple kitchen mutzik was morally superior to any bourgeois European gentleman. The peasants, he maintained, quote, will show us a new path, and, far from having something to teach them, he said, it is we who must bow down before the people's truth. So that's what this chapter focuses on. The peasant marriage is really about this idealized view of what the serf represented and how the serfdom almost became a representation of the state of Russia itself, the ideal state of Russia. Figes talks about the Russian artists and intellectuals who used this concept. In the 19th century, there was a phase where realism became important in painting, as in the picture below, where sketches were done from life of peasants as they worked to produce the portrait that you can see that seems to champion their unpretentiousness, their honesty, their hard work and sacrifice. Now, Figes also notes that this idea of the natural nobility of the peasant, it caused some conflicted reactions to industrial and commercial development, obviously, because in order to develop the country industrially, you would have to move away from this manual simplicity that you can see depicted here. And of course, Figes also takes a hard-nosed look at what peasant life was really like and how little it resembled this mythic ideal. If you are thinking about reading Tolstoy in 2024, it is in this chapter that Figes begins to look at the author's life, and it will be tough reading. I think if Tolstoy were alive today and social media revealed the details about his private life, I think a lot of readers would have to have some personal questioning about whether or not they wanted to read his works. Tolstoy was problematic, and he remained problematic throughout his life. He also was hero worshipped. In my last video, I mentioned that he was a descendant of the Volkonsky family, the famous Decembrists. And so he grew up very wealthy, and he was at ease with that until he got to his 30s. And that's when he began to be affected by this same idea that was affecting everyone else, this idealization of the peasant life. And this is what I hope that Orlando Figes would do, is give me a greater understanding of Tolstoy, because at some point I would like to reread War and Peace and other bits of Tolstoy's writing, rather. But it's not just a chapter about Tolstoy. It's a bit of an artistic who's who, to be truthful. Figes will talk about Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Chekhov. And so if you're into classical music also, the sections where Figes talks about the formation of the Ballet Russe and also the origin of Igor Stravinsky's The Firebird, they were eye-opening. Oh, and I also found out, the Russian nesting dolls? I always thought that they were some centuries-old craft tradition. But, like all these things, they were a late 19th century invention. If you remember the previous video, I was looking at the maps in the front of the book, and I'd spotted 2 artistic communes. Well, these dolls were invented at one of those communes. They were invented to meet a demand that was happening in Moscow, sort of around the late 19th century. People, the middle classes, wanted authentic folk art to decorate their homes. And so somebody invented these dolls, and they became supremely popular. And then, of course, the myth of where they came from spread, and that's what we have. That's what we think they are today. It's fascinating. So that brings us to Chapter 5. Now, Chapter 5 was titled In Search of the Russian Soul, and it discusses how Christianity shaped Russian thinking. Figes focuses on 2 concepts which are unique to Orthodox Christianity, and then he shows how it was those concepts that influenced Russian cultural expression. So the first concept was the priority of ritualized activity in the worship service. Western Christianity is slightly differently focused, whether it's Catholic or Protestant. Catholicism has ritual, yes, but the nature of the Mass is that believers are seated, and they are focused. Their attention is focused in one place. They're observing and responding to activity happening up at the front where the altar is. Protestantism also has, again, believers seated, and they're either watching or listening to activity initiated by one, maybe 2 people. Again, that's coming from a single pulpit or altar. Now, Orthodox services, and this is the idea I got from Figes, but I also watched some YouTube videos. The Orthodox services involved believers entering a building, yes, but they didn't sit, they stood. And while they were mainly in the central floor space, in larger cathedrals, you would also have believers facing towards they were facing the outer walls rather than, facing the altar as such, because they might be having private prayers to any number of the icons that are posted on the walls. Believers aren't segregated. There's something about the furniture of pews, isn't there, that puts people in a set location, and it can create a hierarchy of location, can't it? Whereas in an Orthodox church, you sense that there was the possibility for the group to be mixed in terms of social status. And in the Orthodox Church, there's so many more clergy at the front doing many, many things that are part of the liturgy. And so you can't really focus necessarily on any one thing because there's so much going on. And therefore, the liturgy itself functions more as an accompaniment, as an aid to personal worship, rather than the act of worship itself. And so Figes wanted to point out the social and spiritual significance of all those differences. Firstly, if the congregation can be more homogenized, if classes can mix and move together rather than remaining in assigned set places, then the act of worship kind of becomes a social leveler. Secondly, if the believer's worship is really more assisted or enhanced by priests rather than directed and focused, then the nature of the priesthood also is leveled. In addition to this aspect of social leveling, Figes also described a very different concept of faith. He posits that in Western Christianity, medieval and Renaissance and early modern, it was assumed that reason could and would justify a man's faith, that believing in God could be proven to be a rational choice. And of course, that assumption led to the 19th century crisis of faith, in Europe and the European colonies, when it became clear that rationality would not necessarily back up religious belief. Fiji says the Orthodox Church never accepted that faith in God could be justified by reason. Reason was seen as a human mental function. And since God was beyond any human thought process, that nothing human could possibly apprehend God, faith therefore remained a matter of feeling. It was a mystical experience that by definition would defy reason. Figes takes these concepts and he presents evidence for how they influenced artistic expression. And he spends a lot of time talking about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov. And I'm so glad, because I feel sure that this chapter, I'm going to have to go back to it. It's going to be helpful when I come to read these authors. And I feel that without having read Natasha's Dance, I might have struggled to understand what some of these authors were getting at, why they were writing what they were writing. I'm going to leave it there. I have just over 200 pages left on the book and 3 chapters exactly. So I figure I can close Natasha's Dance with one more vlog. That probably won't be ready this year, but I'm determined to finish the book in 2023 because I want to add Natasha's Dance to my Read What You Own challenge book count. That'll get me up to 10 books of my goal total of 53. It's been a long, long read, this book, but it's definitely been worth it. Okay, I shall see you at the wrap-up then. Take care in the meantime. Bye-bye.